the cost of self-repression, the cost of sort of emotional repression. I think everybody is guilty at some point in their life of repressing their emotions. I think men do it a lot as well. I mean, if you look at the suicidality in the UK amongst men.
Men tend to act it out on themselves like that,
What is the cost of self-repression? Now, you talked about the physiological mechanism of what's going on when we repress our emotions and how we feel.
It's been well studied, not just by me, but others, and documented, that repression of healthy anger disturbs the immune system. Now, why should that be the case? Now, healthy anger is simply when somebody is intruding on your space and they won't desist. You say, "You're in my space, get out." That's healthy anger. It's in the moment. When it's done its job, it's finished with. It's different from chronic rage, which is a whole other thing. No, in other words, anger is a boundary defense. That's all it is. Animals do it. Get out of my space. Now, the emotional system in general has the job, the human emotional system in general has the role of allowing in what is nurturing and loving and healthy and welcome, and to keep out what isn't. That's the job of the emotional system. Let me ask you a trick question. What's the job of the immune system? Okay, I'll answer. Is to keep out what is unhealthy and unwelcome and toxic, and to let in what is nurturing and healthy. So the immune system is being called a floating brain. It is memory, it is reactive capacity. And it allows in nutriments and vitamins and healthy bacteria, and keeps out and destroys what isn't, toxins and unhealthy invading organisms and so on. In other words, the immune system and the emotional system have exactly the same role. That's the first point. The second point is they're not separate systems. Physiologically speaking, the emotional system, the nervous system, hormonal apparatus, and the immune system are all one system. And there's a whole new science, when I say new, 60, 70, 80 years old, called psychoneuroimmunology, that studies the unity. So it's not even that all these things are connected, they're one. So therefore, when you're suppressing one aspect of it, you're also suppressing the other. So people that repress healthy anger, they have diminished immune activity. And this has been demonstrated. So the repression of emotions has a physiological function. And when you repress your immune system, you're more likely to have that immune system turn against you or to fail you when it comes to malignancy. The immune system, like you and I have cancer cells in our bodies probably every day because nature makes mistakes. That's not a problem. The immune system recognizes them as cancer cells don't have on their surfaces markers that our normal cells do. So the immune system says, this is a foreigner, it's an enemy, I'm going to destroy it. But when you repress your emotions, you can also undermine your immune system, and now your immune system will not recognize the malignancy and not destroy it, and allows it to proliferate. There was a British surgeon in the 1960s who operated on, am I talking too much?
No, you're not. There's no such thing on this podcast.
Okay. Because I just get so passionate about this stuff. And the reason I get so passionate about it is because it's so important in healing. And we as physicians could do so much more for people if we understood these scientific facts, but we don't as a profession. Anyway, there's a British thoracic surgeon called David Kisson in the 1960s who noticed what I noticed in my practice, that people emotionally repressed are more likely to get lung cancer. Now, it's true that most people who get lung cancers are smokers, but out of 100 smokers, only about 10 or 15 get lung cancer, which doesn't mean that smoking isn't the major contributor to lung cancer. It is. But he found that it was those of his patients that were emotionally repressed that were likely to get the lung cancer as a result of the smoking. And the more repressed they were, the less smoking they had to do in order to get lung cancer. This guy noticed this in the 1960s. So emotional repression has huge implications physiologically. And emotional repression is one of the impacts of childhood trauma.
Why?
The child is born with some fundamental needs. One of them, as I've articulated earlier, is for attachment, for closeness, proximity, unconditional loving acceptance by caring adults. Not just a human child. All mammalian children have that need. Without that, they don't survive. So that's called attachment. The seeking of closeness and proximity for the purpose of being taken care of or to take care of the other. And our brains are wired for attachment. We have circuits in our brain dedicated to the attachment relationships. And that's so important all through our lives, but especially when we're infants and young children. Now, but we have another need. We've already talked about it. I just haven't named it. The other need is for authenticity, which is to be ourselves, connected to our bodies and our gut feelings. Because again, without access to our gut feelings, we don't survive out there in nature, where we evolved and where we lived until 15,000 years ago. You know, and so that authenticity is very important, to be connected to yourself so that you know when you're safe and when you're not. You know what you want and what you don't want. You know how to say no when you don't want something. You know how to say yes when you do. That's authenticity, auto, the self, being ourselves. And to go back to Harry, his challenge all his life was that he wasn't allowed to be authentic. He had to play a certain role and fit into a certain set of expectations of how to be and who to be. And he could never figure out, who am I really, in that context. But that's so general. So many of us face that challenge of who are we really, who are we authentically, as opposed to what's expected of us. Now, so we have these two needs. Attachment on the one hand, authenticity on the other. Ideally, the two are not in conflict. Ideally, you can be in a relationship, or I can be in a relationship where we can be ourselves and be accepted and connected with. And that's ideal all our lives. But what happens to a young child where if they're authentic, they're not accepted? So for example, certain psychologists recommend that angry children should be punished for their anger. Rather than their anger being understood as to what it's all about and the child being taught different ways to express it, they're just to be punished for it, and by different ways. By the way, if you're a parent of a 2-year-old and if you don't frustrate your child, you're probably not doing a good job, because your 2-year-old may want a cookie before dinner. And you say, no, cookie before dinner. Oh, I want a cookie, In a minute, they're throwing a tantrum. Because what do even adults do when they're frustrated? They throw tantrums. Children, that's just what they do. They have no self-regulation yet. So the 2-year-old gets upset. Now you punish them. You give them a message, you're not acceptable to me when you're angry. You have to be a certain way for me to accept you. Or you mustn't be sad. Cheer up. What's wrong with you? So when children are given this message of conditionality, that you're acceptable to me only if you behave in ways that I approve of, otherwise the attachment relationship is threatened, then the child is faced with this choice, which is not a choice at all. Do I stay attached to my parents? If my father's an alcoholic, and the only way I can find acceptance is by repressing my emotions and not show my sadness and my fear, then do I show my sadness and my fear or my anger? Or do I threaten the relationship? Well, there's no choice at all. The child will choose the attachment. And therefore they give up connection to themselves, which is the essence of trauma. That disconnection from ourselves, not in my own words, in the words of other trauma theorists who I agree with, the worst aspect of trauma is the disconnection from ourselves. And we do that for the sake of maintaining attachments, which means for the rest of our lives, we'll be afraid to be ourselves.
Is this what they call people pleasers?
People, exactly. So trauma is not just a personal issue. It's very much a social and collective and historical issue.
What's the cure? Because if we're many of us are byproducts of generational trauma, and we're seeking different ways to ease our pain through the means of addiction, whether it's pornography or heroin or alcohol. We can't all afford expensive therapists, but we exhibit those self-destructive behavior patterns maybe every single day, maybe with social media addictions or whatever.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Unfortunately, the healthcare systems around the world have very poor appreciation of the emotional contribution to people's physical or mental ill health. And most physicians and most psychiatrists are not trained in it. Unfortunately, there's a huge gap between science and research on the one hand and medical practice on the other. It's maddening sometimes to contemplate it. So the first step would be to educate the caregivers. Just educate doctors about the actual science of the mind-body connection and the impacts of trauma. Educate them. So when you go to a physician with, say, chronic fatigue or inflammation of your joints, they don't just give you the necessary medication, which I'm not against, but they will also ask you what's going on. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, let's prevent the problem. So let's support young families to be really there for their kids so that families don't have to struggle economically and their parents are so stressed. As I may have mentioned, I've forgotten now, when parents are emotionally stressed, economically stressed, according to a number of studies, the kids' stress hormone levels are abnormal. And that is a harbinger of future disease. And so let's look after young families. Let's make people feel secure. Uncertainty, lack of control, lack of information. These are some of the drivers of physiological stress. So let's create a society where there's more sense of mutual acceptance and communality and social support. Let teachers be educated that the kids who are so-called misbehaving are kids who are actually troubled because of stuff at home, and that the solution is not to exclude them or to punish them, but to actually give them emotional support in the classroom and in the schools. Let the schools be. The human brain, I'm quoting a Harvard study, develops from before birth. It's an ongoing process that begins before birth and continues into adulthood. The necessary conditions for human brain development is safe, supportive emotional relationship with adults. Let everybody who deals with children, from social workers to teachers to daycare workers to kindergarten supervisors to parents, understand the emotional needs of kids and provide that safety. Let the justice system, so-called, about which there's very little just. In Canada, 50% of the women in jail are Indigenous. They make up 6% of the population. 50% of the jail population. You call that justice? You take the most traumatized people who then act out their traumas and then you punish them for it. So let the medical system, let the educational system, let the legal system understand child development and trauma. Now, in terms of the adult, to answer your question more specifically, so there's a social answer, but then there's the individual answer. Yeah, a lot of people can't afford good therapy. It's true. It's expensive. And even there's a lot of people who get therapy but not getting appropriate therapy. Well, if you can't afford therapy, go to the library, read some books. My own, but not just my own. I could rattle off 5 other books you should read. Read Dick Schwartz's book on internal family systems called No Bad Parts. Read Bessel van der Kolk's book on trauma called The Body Keeps the Score. Read Peter Levine's book, Waking the Tiger, on trauma. Read Oprah Winfrey's and Bruce Perry's book, What Happened to You. Read Bruce Perry's book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog.
I'm interviewing Peter Levine.
Oh, you have?
Soon.
Oh, good. Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. He's one of my mentors and friends, and we often work together. So this is, and all of these books will have some advice about how to help yourself, including my books. Then there's a lot of stuff on the internet. So this the interview that you and I had a year ago, I checked this morning, has been seen by 2.5 million people. I'm sure it's helped a lot of people. It's a lot that you can get just, freely. Nobody's going to get charged, on the YouTube. Lots of my talks are available. Lots of talks by other really good people are available. Do that. There are self-help groups of all kinds.
Is there a risk here? This is what the one side of the narrative sometimes argue, that you can kind of over-traumatize your life in terms of over-labeling everything that you do as a trauma. So, and I mean, that always happens, right? When people become aware of something, they become over-aware and they start over-labeling and saying, that's a trauma response, that's a trauma response, that's a trauma response. And they kind of live with a feeling that they are inherently broken.
Yeah, but my point is that nobody's broken. Actually, I talked about our first nature. That's always there. When people recover, it's an interesting word, recovery. What does it mean to recover? When you recover something, what are you doing?
Going back to...
You're finding it.
Oh yeah, I'm sure, yeah. That's the definition of the word, isn't it?
What do people find when they recover? They find their true selves. That's what they'll tell you. That true self never went away. Nobody's damaged goods. Nobody's broken. To talk about trauma is not to disempower people, but to empower them. If I learn that my response to the British media and the Harry issue was actually, it's nothing to do with the present moment. It's actually some old programming. Oh, okay, now I can drop it.
Are you glad it happened?
I'm glad that everything happened, because everything is learning. Nothing in this life is wasted if you know how to use it properly. And so what I'm saying is that to be aware of trauma is not to lose power, but to gain it, because it's not an excuse. I can't keep going to my wife and saying, I'm being resentful of you and punishing you because my mother didn't take good care of me when I was a baby because she was too stressed. I mean, that's lack of responsibility. But for me to understand that my demands on my wife to take care of me like a mother would of a baby actually is my trauma response, then I can drop it, because I'm not a baby anymore. I'm not that helpless. I'm not that resourceless. I'm not that ungrounded. So that when you recognize trauma, it's not in order to use it as an excuse, but to actually to overcome it. That's the whole point.